Hi, this is Dustin Hausner. Welcome to Jewish Culture and Jewish Awareness. I'm the Jewish Outreach and Program Director at the Wayne YMCA. All our Jewish programming is funded through the Jewish Federation of Northern New Jersey. So I would like to welcome a really special guest who's written, I personally think, a very extraordinary book among many extraordinary books that he has written over the years. So I'd like to introduce very briefly Gil Troy, who is an award-winning American presidential historian and leading Zionist activist. He's written several books on the American presidency and the history of presidential campaigning, including biographies on Ronald Reagan and Hillary Clinton. Gil Troy has also written extensively on Zionism, including the book Why I Am a Zionist, Israel, Jewish Identity, and the Challenges of Today, and his latest book, which we will be discussing, The Zionist Ideas, Visions for the Jewish Homeland, Then, Now, Tomorrow. So without further ado, I would like to introduce everyone to the amazing Gil Troy. Gil, it's so wonderful to have you here today.
Wow, that's a very kind introduction. You're going to start getting the $10 check from my dad for being so nice to me every month.
Well, it honestly is a pleasure to have you with us today. And, you know, I went through your book. I find it really interesting. And I guess let's start backing up a little bit for anyone who's not familiar with your work. And again, I did do a nice short introduction, but can you let people know a little bit about, you know, who you are and kind of the work that you do?
Sure, I was born on a hot summer's day in Queens, New York. No, as you sensed, I kind of balance two careers. On the one hand, my main job is being an American historian. I have a PhD in American history from Harvard University. Today, I should say I'm mourning the loss of one of my mentors and really an intellectual hero of mine, Bernard Bailyn, who was one of the great Revolutionary War historians and died at the age of 97. And with his passing, the three really great historians who shaped my thinking, David Donald, Alan Brinkley, and Bernard Bailyn, have all passed, but their ideas and their impact and their example continue. So today's actually a very fraught day for me in that way. And as an American historian, I like to write about the presidency, particularly about the intersection between pop culture and politics. So I wrote a book about Ronald Reagan, Morning in America, about Reagan in the 1980s. About Bill Clinton and the 1990s and how and I organize it chapter by chapter, 80, 81, 82, 90, 91, 92. I tell the story not only about the president, but about what's going on in music, in art, in the movies, to try to really show what's the experience. It's kind of like decades book meets presidency book. Mm-hmm. So that's one part of my work. And the second part is working on questions of Zionism and Jewish identity. And the key and the connector, which really comes through, I think, in this book, The Zionist Ideas, is that right now, especially in the university, we have a crisis over the meaning of American nationalism and the meaning of the word nationalism. Nationalism has, I joke, has become the new N-word. It's considered to be only Trumpian and only xenophobic, and only the word white is put in front of it. And whether you love Donald Trump or hate Donald Trump, nationalism is a neutral tool. Nationalism can be used to build walls, but can also be used to open hearts. And I, as an American historian, cannot explain all the good that America has done, all the wonders of America, all the great ideas that have reformed America and have made it not perfect, but much better than it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, without talking about American nationalism. And similarly, when I put on my Zionist activist hat and I try to explain the miracle of Israel, I try to explain all the good that Israel has done without also ignoring some of the challenges and hoping for perfection. I know that nationalism, liberal nationalism, a constructive nationalism is that tool. And so in many ways, the uniting factor in my career is trying to trigger a conversation, not propaganda, not, oh, let's choose one form of totalitarianism over another form of totalitarianism, but no, a mix. And with that, my mentor, my other mentor would be Ed Koch. I know you guys are New Jersey, but I'll have to quote a New Yorker, who said, if you agree with me on 7 of 12 things, please vote for me. If you agree with me on 12 of 12 things, please see a psychiatrist. And I think in modern America today, we all need to see a psychiatrist. If I don't completely believe in Donald Trump, or I don't completely believe in Joe Biden, then I'm somehow a traitor. I want to find a constructive middle. And that constructive middle is important to me as what I call a lowercase L liberal nationalist.
So let me ask you, because it kind of leads into a little bit, because again, we we could be here for days talking about your work in a number of different areas, which I think has been exceptional. But let me ask you in particular to, Why I'm a Zionist was a very personal book you wrote of obviously not just your views, but obviously the history, your explanation of ideology. Whereas your latest book, The Zionist Ideas, is a spiritual continuation of the Zionist idea. So I'm curious because I believe JPS was the one who had asked you to write the Zionist Ideas. What made you, I guess, first want to write a book about, why you're a Zionist, and then what made you want to take on this project of a continuation of a previous text in regards to an expansion of what Zionism is?
My name is Gil Troy, but my Christian name is Gilad Troyansky. My father, like so many Americans, and particularly so many American Jews, was raised with a double message. On the one hand, fit in, and on the one hand, stand out. And so he was born Troyansky, but at a certain point gave his name an anskiectomy and became Troy. So I get great reception at Greek restaurants, and I get a lot of Helen of Troy jokes and a lot of Sparta jokes. And he also gave me this Hebrew name, Gilad. But growing up in New York, I always felt a little bit bizarre about that name because people would see Gilad and start going Gillard. So I liked Gil Troy. It helped me fit in. Indeed, when I was at Harvard, when I was teaching at Bernard Bailyn's course, someone by the name of Richard John looked at me, and many WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, have first names that are last names and last names that are first names. And so he goes to me and he goes, "Oh, there are so few WASPs like us around nowadays," because he assumed Gil Troy could also be a WASPy name. And I put on my heaviest New York accent and said, "Even fewer than you think." But I didn't experience that as anti-Semitism. I experienced that as, wow, I fit in. The skill set that I got to fit in at Harvard was working.
Right.
And I built my career as an American historian as Gil Troy fitting in. Unfortunately, in 2000, when Yasser Arafat led his people away from negotiation and back toward terror, when he was tired of the peace negotiation and simply started blowing up buses, and immediately, especially I was living in Canada at the time, teaching at McGill University, it was Israel's fault. Right. I was traumatized. I didn't understand how a country that had really tried through the Oslo peace process, with all its limitations too, was immediately in the docket, immediately guilty. And Americans are instinctively more pro-Israel. 75% of Americans are pro-Israel than Canadians, who tend to be 45% pro-Israel. In Montreal, it was even harsher. And so I started writing, hiding behind my name, Gil Troy, articles in defense of Israel and against terrorism. But at a certain point, I felt like I had to really come out of the closet. And I wrote an 800-word article in the Montreal Gazette for Israel Independence Day 2001, Why I'm a Zionist, which had nothing disrespectful against the Palestinians, because I respect every human being and I respect every national movement that's constructive, that's seeking peace, but simply affirmed what it means to be a Zionist. And I knew that by doing that, Gil Troy would now be forever tagged. And I was attacked as a racist, and I was attacked as an imperialist and as a colonialist. Look how coincidental it is that the worst crimes in the world are always appended to Zionism and appended to the Jews. What I didn't expect was how many, back in those days, because it was 2000, we got these things called letters. They came in envelopes with stamps and addresses, right? I got letters and I got emails saying, wow, somebody's saying something positive. And so really in the space of a couple of months, I wrote this book as a kind of very personal statement, both responding to the challenges of the fight, but also really trying to give a positive vision of why, wherever we live, in New Jersey, in New York, in Montreal, as I was living at the time, or living in Jerusalem, what does it mean to be a part of this conversation about identity? What does it mean to be a part of this conversation about Jewish nationalism? And Jewish nationalism doesn't negate American nationalism, because both of them are liberal democratic forms of nationalism. And so from there, I really started a second career, because I saw that there was this need in the Jewish world. I'm tired of Israel advocacy. I'm tired of defending. I want to have a deeper conversation. I want to put Bibi aside. I want to put BDS aside. I want to put the Palestinians aside. I want to have a conversation about possibility and opportunity and identity. What does it mean to be living in the 21st century and have this connection to this 3,500-year-old story of a people? What does it mean to be living in the me, my, more, now world of today and also be a part of an us and ask some deep, profound questions. And so I've been really now running kind of two conversations, as I said at the beginning. One as an American historian, the second as a Zionist activist, but both of them are really trying to ask questions of who are we? Who can we be? And how by joining constructive groups can we not only become better people, but also make the world a better place?
So it kind of falls under the, well, obviously your writings, of course, but the idea of, the Zionist terminology of how it's used today in a very almost simplistic manner of what you are or are not that falls under Zionist. And what's interesting about your particular book, The Zionist Ideas versus, let's say, The Zionist Ideas, it goes through the history, talks about kind of the different groupings that helped lead to kind of perpetuation of what we knew at Israel at the time, which of course this was written in the 50s, and you have many more decades of experience and knowledge in writing it now. But you go through, and I want to make sure I say the term correctly, I believe you say the 6 intellectual stems, and you focus the chapters on these different forms of Zionism. And I'm curious, and for anyone who hasn't read the book yet, it's talked about political Zionism, labor Zionism, revisionist Zionism, religious Zionism, cultural Zionism, and diaspora Zionism. I'm curious why for the book did you feel, and even just for the conversation as a whole, did you think those were the 6 stems that you could really create thought and be able to use for the founding, the builders, and the trailblazers and so forth?
So just to step back for a second. So I write this book, Why I'm a Zionist, which is a more personal statement. And then I was given this tremendous challenge and honor, and here's a New Jersey tie, because Arthur Hertzberg was a rabbi who served in a New Jersey congregation for many, many years, and was a real icon both in New York and New Jersey Zionist circles. And in 1959, he came out with this book called The Zionist Idea. It was an anthology of 34 writings, 34 thinkers who took a broken, lost people, brought them back to their homeland, and helped them find pride and resurrect themselves. And think about it. In 1959, Israel was fragile, in between wars, barely functional economy. Yet the Zionist conversation was robust. Today, Israel is robust, but the Zionist conversation has turned fragile. And to update the Zionist idea, I did 3 moves. One, from the idea to the ideas, because indeed, as you point out, decades have passed, the conversation has opened up, and I want to bring in more light. I want to bring in more air. I'm suffocating from a conversation about Zionism, which is too politicized, too partisan, too defensive, from the left or from the right. So I add the S, and also, of course, the S is a question mark, and we have too many exclamation points, and let's open up with questions. So we go from the Zionist idea to the Zionist ideas. And then indeed, as you pointed out, as a historian, I have to, we call periodize, put it in historical context. So we start with the builders, we start with the dreamers, the pioneers, the initial thinkers until 1948. Then the first 50 years or so is the builders. And who are we today? The torchbearers. Because we're heirs to this amazing tradition, but like in an Olympic relay, we now have to figure out how do we keep it going, and do we need an alternate energy source, and how do we move on and pass it on to the next generation? But the third move, we go from Zionist idea to Zionist ideas. We put an intellectual chronological structure of, till 1948, 1948 to 1998, and today on it. But I wanted people to get a sense of, wow, there's this active conversation. I wanted people to pick up a random article about Zionism and be able to put it in the context of a broader stream of thought. Now, if I was a good academic, I would have some story about some pointy-headed intellectual who taught me something. But because, as I said, and as you kindly pointed out, I'm a bit of a Zionist activist, my background actually comes from camp. And I'm at Camp Tel Yehuda, which is a camp on the, where Pennsylvania and Delaware and New Jersey meet on the Delaware River. And where New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania meet on the Delaware River. And I'm 15. And we're learning about Zionism. And we have an old charismatic educator named Mel Reesfield, who doesn't have his Oz, but has his ideology intact. And he says, I need a black beard, a white beard, a hoe, and a wheel. And we go, okay, Mel's off his raka. The weather in New York, New Jersey during this period can be kind of humid. What's he talking about? But it was actually a brilliant way of explaining to 15-year-olds this very complicated, multidimensional conversation about Zionism.
Mm.
The Blackbeard, Theodor Herzl, political Zionism. The Jews are a people, not just a religion. They have ties to a particular homeland. Doesn't preclude others from having ties to that homeland. But they, like in Manhattan, right? Because Manhattan was bought for $24 from the natives. So you can have conflicting ties, but you still have ties to that land. And the right to establish a state on that homeland. Political Zionism. Theodor Herzl had a black beard. A white beard is Rav Kook and the rabbis who did religious Zionism to create a conversation based not just on modern nationalism, but also on the Bible. You have a Ho for socialist labor Zionism, because the broken down, beaten up Jew from Eastern Europe is coming to the land and building and being built up and saying, we're returning to the land. And whether or not we're socialists these days, we can learn from socialist Zionism that we don't say, oh, I have my Jewish side and my normal side, as I did when I described myself as an American historian, right? But no, I integrate. I want to link the two. That's part of the Zionist identity conversation. So the Blackbeard, Theodor Herzl, political Zionism. The Whitebeard, Rav Kook, religious Zionism. The Ho, socialist Zionism. We make a fist to be mischievous for revisionist Zionism of Jabotinsky, but that also was a liberal Zionism, a capitalist Zionism, the Zionism that led to today's startup nation and the whole computer revolution taking place in Israel. And the fact that when we talk about which countries in the world are in the rush to help us solve this crazy coronavirus, the fact that little small Israel is part of it is just mind-blowing.
Mm.
And the wheel is cultural Zionism. Why? Because Ahad Ha'am, the great cultural Zionist, said the Jewish people are a wheel, and in the center is Palestine or Israel, and from Zion will come forth all kinds of ideas, like spokes on the wheel, connecting the United States with Israel, connecting Canada, connecting Australia, connecting France with Israel at the center of the Jewish heart and the Jewish experience. And those are the 5 schools of Zionist thought that kind of built and rebuilt the country. And I added a 6th school. And those are the 5 schools that we learned from our charismatic educator, Mel. But I wanted to add a 6th school, which is Diaspora Zionism, what I also call identity Zionism, because there's a whole conversation going on way past Europe and the horrors of the Holocaust, way past anti-Semitism, right here today in New Jersey, right here today in New York, right here today in California, about who am I? And as I said earlier, what does it mean to be a part of this people? What does it mean to have ties to this place and that place? To be connected, to be a proud, patriotic American, but also have an extra tie, an extra heart, if you will, that beats for Zion. And so I wanted to bring that conversation in. And so that was the 6th school of thought. And if you'll permit me a cheap joke, you know those light bulb jokes that we used to tell when we were in elementary school? You know, how many gurus does it take to change a light bulb? Trust your inner light. How many therapists does it take to change a light bulb? You can only change if you're ready to change. How many men does it take to change a light bulb? 1, he holds the light bulb and thinks the world revolves around him. How many feminists does it take to change a light bulb? That's not funny. How many Zionists does it take to change a light bulb? 5. 1, to change the light bulb. And to say, look, Anu Banu Artza, we've returned to the land. Look, we're building and being rebuilt. We're part of this whole Zionist revolution. 2 more to go dancing around with him. Or her, because there was a whole feminist dimension. And I added that also in the book. A 4th to write the check. And the 5th to complain about the media coverage. Once upon a time, the role of the diaspora Zionist, the role of the Zionist in New Jersey, New York, and elsewhere was simply to write the check, shut up, and complain about the media coverage. But no, I'm saying you are a part of the conversation. We're all a part of the conversation. The Zionist ideas, the question mark. Join us. And together, rather than yelling at one another, let's learn from one another, from our strengths and from our weaknesses, from our different experiences. And that's been the exciting thing. Since I've launched the book, we launched it on the eve of the 70th anniversary of the State of Israel. And I said, if I can launch 70 Zionist salons, 70 conversations about Israel and what Israel and Zionism can mean to us in different parts of the world, I feel like, okay, that was my contribution, both to the conversation we need to have about constructive nationalism and the conversation about Jewish identity. I'm happy to say that we've had over 230 in 6 countries in 2 different languages: United States, Canada, South Africa, Australia, UK, Israel, Hebrew, English, and I've seen it in people's eyes. When I stop with the guilt trip, when I stop with, as I said earlier, the partisanship, and I simply invite people to a conversation with these amazing texts about who am I? And you can sit and read a century-old text and go, wow, this guy's struggling with questions of how much change should we have and how much tradition should we have in our lives? How much should we be revolutionaries and how much should we be traditionalists? These are questions we're struggling with today too. What does it mean to be a part of this Jewish people and also a proud American, as Louis Brandeis and Henrietta Zold asked? And so when you invite people to this conversation and you see in their eyes, wow, I'm a part of something bigger, and it doesn't matter where I stand politically, then I feel like we've done a kind of healing from all the ugly, intense partisanship of today, which is so painful and so anguishing and so divisive.
So let me ask, well, I guess 2 parts of this question is, one, in regards to the actual term Zionist, because again, you speak very passionately about obviously what it means to many people, and there's many different ideas and many different things that went into even just the idea of Israel existing first place. And then obviously there's always the idea, and then when it comes true, then you have to govern and then you have to actually make it work. So what to you is an actual constructive definition of Zionist for today's viewer, whoever watching, whether they're someone who's very new to the terminology or someone who's been watching for a long time? And then the second tier one, and as you were alluding to, there's been conversations, but I think there's a challenge of how to have the conversation in itself. So I would love to hear just your advice as someone, especially it sounds like you've had over 200 salons, which I think is fantastic, of how to have that conversation.
So let's divide this into 3. First, we have to start with the fundamental jump, which is actually very difficult for American Jews. And I threw it in quickly before, that the Jews are a people, not just a religion. Right. And the way I explain it is I say Judaism is like an Oreo cookie. Everybody goes, ooh, right? But the Oreo cookie is the most popular cookie in the world. I checked that on the internet, and everything on the internet we know is true. And what's the genius of the Oreo cookie? That it has the cookie part and the cream part, and that together makes it the Oreo cookie. Judaism is this mix of religion and nation. Christianity is a religion. And I say this when I host my Christian brothers and sisters around the table for a Friday night in Jerusalem, back when we could do such things. Christianity is a religion, and people connect to different nations. In Judaism, while you also can have national ties as an American, as a Canadian, as a Brit, as an Australian, the unique thing, and it goes back to Abraham and the Bible, is that we are both part of a people, and that's our hardware, if you will, and our software is this religion. So think of the holiday of Passover. Is it a national holiday or religious holiday? The answer is yes, both, the Oreo cookie. The Western Wall, is it a national symbol of rebirth and pain and ultimate liberation, or is it a symbol of religiosity and faith? The answer is yes, both, the Oreo cookie. Once we make that leap, then we get Zionism. Because Zionism says, A, that the Jews are a people, B, that as a people, they have ties to this particular homeland. As I said, doesn't preclude others having rights to that homeland. And C, like 192 other countries in the United Nations today, we have the rights to establish a state on that homeland. Am Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, Medinat Yisrael. The people of Israel, the land of Israel, the state of Israel. And part 2, the definition, whereas once, until 1948, the Zionist movement was the movement of Jewish national liberation to establish a state of Israel on its historic homeland, Palestine/Israel. Today, it is a movement not just to defend the Jewish democratic state of Israel, but to perfect the Jewish democratic state of Israel and to find meaning in your life through that framework. And just to kind of illustrate that, the great left-wing Israeli novelist Aleph Bet Yehoshua, A.B. Yehoshua, says, a Zionist is someone who understands that Israel is a state of all its citizens, because 20% are non-Jews, but that that particular state, Israel, also belongs to the Jewish people. And he says, if you don't get that second half, I can have coffee with you, I can like you, you can be a proud Israeli, but you can't also call yourself a Zionist. To be a Zionist, you have to get the fact that there's this peoplehood connection and these people are tied to the land. Now, once we do that, we actually have an opportunity to go away from the politics, to go away from the partisanship. And let me be clear, I'm not afraid of political conversations. I'm an American political historian. I love political conversations. I write a column in the Jerusalem Post every week, which if it was just, kumbaya and happiness, nobody would ever read and they'd fall asleep in the middle. But I think we spend too much time setting up, especially the conversation about Israel, over differences and over debates without first starting with the fundamentals. So I flip it. I say, okay, let's get to politics. Let's talk about Palestinians. Let's talk about challenges. But first, let's talk about what unites us. And I've done this with just left-wingers. I've done this with just right-wingers. And I've done this with a mix of left-wingers or right-wingers, religious and non-religious. And when I say, let's look at the possibilities, let's first start with the 7 of 12 things that we agree on, and then get to the 5 of 12 things. Two things happen. One, we create a shared vocabulary. And two, we realize, you know what? We agree a lot more than we disagree. So let me just zero in, if I may, with a very specific situation. J Street, which is the left-leaning Israel lobby that was established at the start of the Obama administration, which was often very critical of Israel, but still defines itself as Zionist. They announced, J Street U announces that they're going to have a birthright trip. And I'm very involved in Birthright, that wonderful organization, which gets Federation sponsorship, among others, to bring young Jews to Israel, to give them a taste, a non-political, non-partisan taste of what this conversation about Israel and Zionism is all about. And we don't go to the right, we don't go to the left. We don't have a ZOA trip. The Zionist Organization of America is a right-wing organization, proudly right-wing, and we don't have J Street trips. So it was news to us. So I wrote an open letter in the Jerusalem Post saying, we don't do this. This is news to us. What are you claiming that there's this trip that isn't happening? And to their credit, they invited me to speak to them, to the group when it came to Israel. And I made 3 moves, which answer your question of how we change the tone. I don't boycott anybody because these are my students, these are my kids, this is my family. So the first thing I did is I invited them to my home. Messages were one. We might have political differences, but we have a common conversation. You invited me to speak. I didn't ask where you stood politically. I didn't ask where you came from. I just wanted to have a conversation with you. You wanted to have a conversation with me. We meet there. So first, I invited them to my home. Second, I went down to the Shuk to Machane Yehuda, the Jerusalem market, and I bought these Ui Gui Rugelach from Marzipan, which are these chocolatey desserts that would somehow survive nuclear war and still be ooey and gooey. I don't know how they do it. I don't know what their secret is. And why? Because the best way to a student's heart is through his or her stomach. But again, we're home. And then I took off this exact same watch that I have on, and I gave it to one of the students, and I said, we have an hour together. Give me half an hour, and you have half an hour. But give me the first half hour. And what we did is we read Zionist texts. What we did is we read the Zionist ideas that wasn't yet published, but we read some of the basic ideas of peoplehood, land, and statehood, with working on that really difficult word for progressives, the N-word, nationalism. And halfway through, at about the 15 mark, a student shot up his hand and said, you know, I'm a progressive, and people are always bashing nationalism, and people are always bashing Israel. We've never had a conversation about why Israel. So thank you. When the half hour was up, I said, okay, now let's talk about Palestinians, let's talk about borders, let's talk about settlements. Any question is open for conversation, because if we don't ask questions here, where will we learn? Sure. But 2 things happened. And now I'm going back to what I said earlier. I'm being repetitious on purpose. We saw that A, we shared a common vocabulary, and B, the tone had changed. If we had started with where we disagree, and that's what often happens in the American community today and in the American Jewish community, we would have emphasized clash. But we started with where do we agree, and then we'll get to our disagreements. And that's what we need to do. We need to not be afraid of difficult conversations. I was at the APAC conference a couple of years ago, and I can boast about this because it wasn't my idea, but I ran a session. The tough questions people need to ask. It was off the record. And the homework of people coming into the session was to come with the politically incorrect questions. Ask the questions in that space that people get offended when you ask.
Sure.
About settlements, about Palestinians, because life is complicated. And as you point out so eloquently, yeah, we went from an ideal to reality. And ideals are easy to paint in blue and white. Reality is often in grays. And so that's our challenge, to still dream in blue and white, to still try to make the grays blue and white, but to understand that there are grays and blacks and reds and other difficult colors too, because it's a messy situation sometimes.
So you keep mentioning, obviously, reading different types of texts in order for a person to kind of understand what Zionism is, understanding nationalism, so forth. In your book, obviously, you do a large array of different people and different types of ideology. I'm curious, for someone who wanted to start reading texts, what would be the sources that you would recommend for at least the beginning of understanding and knowledge to be able to then expand and to hopefully have the conversation? What would you want people to read in the beginning?
That's a great question. So first of all, politically, practically, the book is organized not just for the academic, but for the beginner. And there's an introduction, and I try to make the table of contents pretty well organized. So but one of the exciting things, when I first experienced the book, The Zionist Idea, actually in summer camp, one of the great things about the book is it's very short. Each selection is very short, much shorter actually than they were back in the when it came out in 1959. And you can swim, you can jump. You don't have to read it from start to finish. In fact, I never read the book, The Zionist Idea, from start to finish until I was asked to update it. So you just kind of, you can swim, you can taste. So half my answer is just plunge in. But I also created a website, www.zionistsalon.com and .co.il. And on there are much more basic how-tos, how to start a basic Zionist conversation. But what I would say is, you can start really from, English or Hebrew, from left to right or right to left. You can start with some of the oldies but goodies, people like Theodor Herzl, people like Henrietta Zold, people like David Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, and see what they had to say, what their Zionism was. Or come to the modern conversation and look at what people like Yossi Klein Halevi, Daniel Hartman, Leah Shaktiel have to say. And and one way or another, in some ways it's about the text, but it's also in some ways about the questions. The questions we want to be asking are, who am I and who are we? Who can I be and who can we become? And how can this conversation make Israel a better place and make the world a better place? And those kinds of conversations. And really, we always have to start with who am I? Because I think that's, as someone who loves the university and someone who loves students and I'm not one of those guys who says, oh, kids these days, they're not so good. But one of the things I really see that hurts me on the modern campus is how many students seem lost. How many young people get to university and after registering go straight to psychological health services because not only have they been under such pressure to succeed, to perform, to get that ideal sky-high GPA and that superstar resume and write that insane essay about how I, at the age of 17, have saved the world and that's why you have to accept me to fancy schmancy you. So there's the pressure thing, but also in all that performance, they've developed their minds and they've developed their ambitions, but they haven't developed their souls. And Yale University, a couple of years ago, launched a class on happiness. And to their surprise, it ended up being the most popular class in Yale history. I think over 1,700 students signed up. And a lot of the homework assignments weren't what's the theory of happiness, but take yourself on an art date, take yourself to lunch, make yourself happy. And they did a study, 50% of students at Yale at one point or another during their 4 years will experience a severe psychological crisis. That shows that somehow we're not doing enough psychological Pilates. We're not building ourselves up. And I'm not arrogant enough to say that Zionism is the only way or the best way. It's my way. It's my way in. It's my way of saying, hey, you know what? We're lucky. We're part of a 3,500-year-old conversation about how to be a good person. We're part of a 3,500-year-old conversation about how to find meaning in life. Join it if you wish, and maybe you'll learn something.
You've kind of answered it just now, but I'm going to ask the question anyway in a kind of different way. So we're talking about, in many ways, a person who would be interested in Zionism, someone who wants to learn more, expand, or wants to have the conversation. But what would you say to people who would be just don't want to even talk about it at all, because they know if they're not on one perspective or another perspective, then they automatically feel like they're shunned or they're called intellectually, inadequate or so have you. So I guess I'm curious, for a person who has heard the term, doesn't know much, and is scared in many ways to learn more, because again, if they don't fit a certain ideology, and you talked about it with partisanship, but also just in general with social media and how, if you say something, there's like a rapid backlash depending on how it's contextualized, why should they get into the conversation of discussing Zionism and Zionist ideas?
This is very painful to me. Look at me. I'm a case of arrested development. I got to the university and never left. I love the university. I love the university life. I love the culture of questioning. I love the culture of openness. And today, you're right, it's on social media, but not only in social media, in the universities it's themselves. In these, what are supposed to be centers of critical thought and learning, we have a double problem. One, we have in general, what you point out, a judgmentalness, a totalitarianism, an all or nothingness that's suffocating. And unfortunately, before they started canceling Americanism, first they canceled the Jews and they canceled Zionism. And for the last 20 years, we've seen a systematic campaign to demonize not just Israel, but Zionism, to demonize students, both Jewish and non-Jewish, who indeed just want to ask questions about what Zionism means. And it's very, very painful. It's very, very anguishing. It's unacceptable. And unfortunately, the disproportionate obsession with Israel and with Israel's flaws, the lack of balance in the conversation, smells of anti-Semitism. I'm not one who says that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, but when you're so obsessed, when you single out not China, not Pakistan, but democratic Israel with all its flaws, but with all its strengths, and make it such an obsession, there's a problem. So how do you do it? I think, unfortunately, it takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of strength. You have to be willing to not be bullied. You have to be willing to risk being bullied, right? And you have to say, wait a minute. I'm just asking questions here. And I always try to start off again with the identity questions. Who are you? What's going on? What's your connection? One of the things we see why birthright is so powerful is because it doesn't start with, oh, sign on the dotted line here. It starts with, hey, just come on a 10-day trip, taste it, experience it. And so many Jewish kids go, wow, this is just not at all what I expected. So you start with the unexpected. You start with the invitation, not with the guilt trip. I mean, one of the first things I do often if I'm at a university and I'm invited to speak about Zionism and the group is small enough, I know a death way to start would be to go around and ask people who their favorite Zionist thinker is. So instead, I go around and I say, tell me who your favorite Israeli is. It could be a friend. It could be a relative. It could be a fictional character you read in a book. It could be a historical character. And what happens? People start with, again, I've done this with Jews and non-Jews. They might say a father, a friend, Moshe Dayan, Abba Eben. They get to Gal Gadot, he. They start relaxing. And I say, see what we just did? Two things. One is we got out of the box of Zionism, of Israel just being a heavy topic. We got out of the box of it only being political. We saw cultural figures, we saw relatives, we saw friends, we saw goofy people, we saw celebrities, sports stars, movie stars, Wonder Woman herself. And then look at your body language. You relaxed, you laughed. Let's diffuse some of the tensions. Let's roll it down a little bit and let's start a conversation as we start about anything. Look, these days, the conversation about America itself is fraught. I'm well aware of the ugliness of slavery, the ugliness of racism, but if every conversation starts about the racial tinderbox and the failures of America, and we never get to some of the successes of America, we'll never see how to heal America. So there too, the educator has to start with a light touch, with an open heart, and with a willingness to see complexity. I always say to students, both when I'm wearing my American history hat and my Zionist activist helmet, I say, if you say to me, hallelujah, I see the light, we're in trouble. Because somebody else is going to come. They're definitely going to be better looking, smarter, funnier than I am. And you'll say, hallelujah, I'll see your light. But if you say, I see the grays, I see the complexity, now the conversation begins.
So I won't ask you who your favorite historical figure was in regards to talking about Zionism. I'll avoid that question, but I would be curious because I know this book was obviously written by you, but also by an amazing team that helped research and do other work for the book. But I'm curious if there was anyone particular who surprised you in maybe their viewpoint of what Zionism is or their interpretation of what Zionism could be. I'm curious if there was anyone that particularly surprised you or that you think readers would necessarily be surprised if they read their views or ideology.
Yeah, so for example, somebody you wouldn't expect to find in a Zionist anthology is a scientific genius by the name of Albert Einstein. And it's complicated because Einstein was a pacifist. Einstein, in his heart of hearts, was a cosmopolitan universalist internationalist. Mm-hmm. So what's he doing in a Zionist book? And I actually spent a lot of time kind of studying it and seeing if he truly fit in. But as someone who understood the German experience, the German Jewish experience, as someone who witnessed World War II, he said, look, in the ideal world, I wish we could all be, speaking Esperanto and transcend. But I know that this broken down, persecuted people needs a home. I know that the world is organized by 193 different, now at the time it was 42, different countries in the UN. And so I pragmatically embrace the Zionist ideal and the Zionist idea. I still hope for peace. I still hope that we can one day get to it. And what's interesting is it parallels a wonderful text by Letty Karen-Pogrebin, who was one of the founders of Ms. Magazine and one of the first, really one of the founders of feminism. And she said, Zionism and feminism are very similar because they're both movements about self-help, about self-respect, about building dignity, that have a political dimension which is sometimes demonized by others and sometimes disrespected by others. And many, many feminists, like many, many Zionists, want to live in a world where they can transcend this particular identity. But as long as they live in this world, this pragmatic world, this real world, they're going to double down on their identity and dream about a world where they can ultimately put it aside. So she said, in the world I dream of, we can all live kumbaya as universalists. But in the world I live in, we need Zionism, not only for self-protection, not only for self-defense, but also for self-fulfillment. And another surprise I'll throw out is someone like Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism, is always read as the anti-Semite, the defensive Zionist, the garrison Zionist, the Zionist who is simply there saying, well, if they hate us, we've got to run away. But read his work, read his texts. He ultimately sees nationalism, and this goes back to the opening conversation we were having about nationalism, as a framework for idealism, a framework for healing, a framework for fulfillment. And he ultimately believes that the Jews, like all peoples, once they're in their homeland, if they can create a liberal democratic state, will indeed be able to build a better world. And so he isn't just an anti-Semite, but he is a pro-Zionist, and he's a pro-Jew, and he's a visionary thinker. And those are the kind of surprises I try to kind of pack into the book.
One interesting, again, there was a number of interesting things, but one thing you mentioned in our conversation, also I know you've mentioned previous interviews, you talk about the idea of kind of the feminist Zionist or an eco-Zionist, or can you talk a little bit about that in the sense of what does it mean? Because it almost goes into the idea of almost like identity politics in the sense of being that, but at the same time, there seems to be an expansion of Zionists that you're talking about as a concept. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So this goes in two different directions. One is that, this book that I inherited, The Zionist Idea, was the Zionist idea, right? 34 males, mostly from Eastern Europe, pushing a certain idea and creating a miracle, right? When they started that conversation in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, most Jews didn't live in Israel. Today, it's almost 50% of the Jewish world. The Jews who were moving from Eastern Europe, 2 million of them were going on the boat, as if there was one boat, to America. And a very, very, very small percentage were going to Israel. But through their debates and through their salons and through their ideas, they created a state. Updating the book, I wanted to open the conversation, as I said. Idea to ideas, exclamation mark to question mark. And part of that was indeed being mischievous because, and it goes back to some of the other excellent questions about the pain of Zionist identity, Jewish identity being disrespected on campus, of us being blocked at the intersection, right? And not being part of the intersectionality movement, when in fact, if you want to talk about people who've endured trauma and maybe have insights to share with African Americans, with women, with LGBTQs who have endured trauma, Jews unfortunately have PhDs and masters in enduring trauma. So I specifically wanted to lean into identity politics to say, yes, Zionism isn't just a political movement, but also is an expression of identity. And yes, I can be a feminist and a Zionist. I can be an environmentalist and a Zionist, a green Zionist. I can be a proud gay member of my gay coalition and a Zionist. And part of it also came from the fact that my feminist students were telling me, I'm told on campus, you have to choose. Again, blocked at the intersection. You can't be a good feminist if you're a Zionist. Wait a minute. What does one have to do the other? And look at Ledikat and Pogrobin. You have to choose between being a proud gay person or lesbian and a Zionist. Wait a minute. What's the only country in the Middle East that's welcoming to gays? That has Tel Aviv as a gay-friendly tourist spot back when we used to have tourism. A country where Palestinians sometimes flee from the Palestinian Authority to find refuge in Israel. How's that for an irony? Because of the different policies in Israel toward all kinds of people, including LGBTQ people. And by the way, I should point out that in the army itself, you also have, when Bill Clinton was still, liberal Democrat, was still pushing don't ask, don't tell, the Israeli army was just accepting for decades before that. So is Israel perfect on this score or on other scores? No, but is it way ahead? Yes. So I wanted to say, yeah, Zionism is part of that conversation. It's part of that identity conversation. And yes, it gets complicated. I'm an Ethiopian Jew. I still have a strong Ethiopian identity. I also have a Zionist identity. I am a Russian Jew. I can still have a strong Russian identity and also a Zionist identity. We're identity jugglers in the modern world. It's not either or, it's and. It's making a whole new pastiche, a whole new symphony of identities.
So I do want to give you some time to actually talk about your upcoming book, which I would love you to talk a little bit about. I believe the title is Never Alone, excuse me, Never Alone, Prison, Politics, and My People. Can you tell our watchers, our listeners, can you tell us a little bit about the upcoming book?
Sure. So 2 transition points from the Zionist Ideas.
Please.
When you're writing a book, you wake up every morning and the to-do list never ends. And so when I finished the Zionist Ideas and we had this groundswell of interest with over 200 Zionist salons, as I mentioned, I said, you know what? I just need a year off from book writing. Hold that thought. But I also, when I finished the Zionist Ideas, I said, who would it be ideal to ask to write the foreword to the Zionist Ideas? And I thought of my hero, someone who I knew a little bit, but had never worked closely with, Natan Sharansky, that famous Soviet Jewish refusenik, that extraordinary hero who stared down the Soviet Union, who was in the Gulag for 9 years. And so I sent him an email and I said, I'm writing this book, and I actually consulted with him before about who else should be included in the book. And I said, I'd really be honored if you'd write the foreword. So I get, he was at the time the head of the Jewish Agency, the world's largest NGO, the world's largest Jewish NGO. And we had one of these classic conversations. So I think I'm going there to find out if he's going to write the foreword.
Right.
And he starts talking about how he's finishing his 9 years in the Jewish Agency, and he's retiring, and he wants to write a book. He starts telling me about this book, and I'm going like, where is this conversation going? And at the end, I say, you know, that's great. I'm wondering, you know, I'm writing this book, The Zionist Ideas. Would you be willing to write the foreword? He said, yeah, of course. Like, he'd already decided. Now I know him well. He had said yes when he got the email. Okay, somehow hadn't told me about it. But he said, no, I'm asking you if you want to write the next book with me as my co-author. I was like, what? So I walked out of that meeting both with the foreword to my old book and a new book project. And, you know, I joke that the KGB itself couldn't say no to Natan Sharansky. So how could I say no to Natan Sharansky? And how was the book organized? 999. He said, I was 9 years in Gulag. I was 9 years in Israeli politics. I was 9 years in Jewish Agency. I don't know where I suffered most. And we literally signed a book contract, 999. And I always hated the topic, the title. I love the joke. It's actually the structure of our book, because what we're doing is we're using his worldview and his experiences to give our worldview about Zionism, about dialogue, about fighting totalitarianism, both the totalitarianism in the Soviet Union and the totalitarianism we touched on campuses and on social media today. And, but 999, you can't have a title that's an inside joke. And also, I'm thinking of some of my Christian brothers and sisters. 999 might be like 666 and the devil. I just didn't want to go there.
Sure.
Plus, somebody else joked to me, said, you know, they might think it's a German book, 999, no, 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 and it's very negative. So all in all, I'm out in Los Angeles. I'm speaking to a friend of mine, David Suissa, and I tell him, you know, I'm looking for a title. And he says, well, tell me about the book. And I say, well, you know, the book is structured 999, and when Natan Sharansky, and part of it is the power of the connection that Sharansky felt with the Jewish people, even when he was in the Gulag. And when he was in the Gulag, the Soviets bullied him and tortured him and cut him off even from the rules that the Soviets had about what kind of visits he should get. They were really trying to break him. And they kept on telling him, you're forgotten, you're abandoned. Nobody cares about you. Just sign this paper, just give in. And he says, I knew I was never alone because I was connected to the Jewish people and they were with me wherever I went. No matter how lonely and isolated I was in an isolation chamber, I was never alone. And my friend goes, that's it. He says, for 75 years, the Jewish people have been obsessed with never again. And of course, we have to continue to honor and revere the memory of the Holocaust and say never again. But we have to give an affirmative message too. And the affirmative message to the Jewish people is never alone. When you're a part of this people, this 3,500-year-old conversation about identity, about eternity, about Israel, you're never alone. And we add, as good liberal nationalists, that this isn't just a book for the Jewish people. This is a book for all of us who are suffering at this moment, to say that when you're a part of a constructive liberal nationalist conversation, you're never alone. And we've seen it in COVID. We've seen it in the COVID crisis. Natan makes a very interesting point that, think about it. What have we learned from COVID? On the one hand, lockdown, my home is my fortress. I need my family. I need to go into my little germ pod. Nothing is more profound than that particularist message of build the wall. But how are we going to solve this crisis? Only by the international community of science. And we've also learned how interconnected we are, because somebody gets sick in Wuhan, and before you know it, we're in quarantine in New Jersey. And so we've learned the double lesson of life, the double lesson of the Jewish people, the double lesson of the American experience, which is that we need to be particular. We need to connect to one another in a very profound way, never alone. But we also cannot use that to build up barriers. We also have to soar and think and connect to others. And so that's the tension of the book, and that's the tension of the Jewish people, and that's the tension of life. And I have to say, it was a tremendous honor and a tremendous privilege to sit with him, to work with him. You know, I'm a historian, so I spend a lot of time looking behind the scenes, reading the memos, discovering that this president, this first lady, this Secretary General of the UN wasn't as delightful, as charming, as wonderful as they appeared on paper. This guy's the real deal. And his wife, Avital, also. To sit with them, these people are so modest, so humble. They live their values. I think one of his biggest criticisms of me when I would write was, "You make me hero." He lives his life as a normal person. He normalizes everything. And he doesn't want this book to be about aggrandizing him. We both want this book to be about building up these big ideas. And the book comes out September 1st. As you can hear, the book is called Never Alone. We just got the first copies in the office in New York on Friday. And so it's being shipped to us. I haven't yet seen a hard copy, so I can't wave it in front of you. But it's been a very exciting transition. And now, of course, the big question is, how do you get people in the age of COVID who are just sitting at home watching on Zoom to actually go and click on Amazon and have the book come over and buy and actually buy the book? But the most important thing for us is, how do we change the tone of the conversation? How do we use this heroic story, this charming story, to invite people into a conversation, not about how wrong you are, but I have something to learn from you, even if we disagree, and even if we have different perspectives. And that dialogue is so important. He says it's the dialogue that saved my life. It's the dialogue that saved me from the suffocating gulag. And imagine, I mean, it's disappointing for me, but imagine how devastating it is for him, someone who freed himself from the totalitarianism of the Soviet Union and the Soviet conversation, to now see what you yourself pointed out is the new totalitarianism on social media, in, I'm sorry to say, left-wing circles, right-wing circles, in the university. That's not how we learn. That's not how we grow. We need unity that isn't based on uniformity. And that's the message of the book.
So let me ask, for anyone who wants to learn more about you, wants to take a look at your books, wants to see what's going on with you, where is the best places for people to find you?
www.giltroy.com. Gil Troy, Giltroy, 1L, is my website. I have a newsletter which you can sign up from there, where I would send out my weekly columns and obviously some of the book reviews, which haven't yet started coming in, but hopefully will soon. And let's continue the conversation. You obviously did your homework. I'm really moved by how deep a dive you did into the books, especially into the Zionist ideas. I know it's a weighty tome, and I really appreciate your invitation and your questions and the tone of openness that really is a tone that we really need to spread. I actually believe that there's a lot more out there like that than we give credit for.
No,
These little fascistic devices make us think that everybody is reducing every complex thought to a tweet, and everybody's bullying. I think many people are fed up. I think some people are scared, but I think more and more people want to have this kind of conversation. I've seen that with the Zionist salons. I've seen that when I've gone on university campuses. I'll tell you one last story, and then for you, I was in England and did a speaking tour with the Zionist Ideas. And I was up in Warwick, far away from London. And we were doing a talk, and they were really nervous. Over 120 students had signed up for a 120-person hall. There was a police plan. There was a security plan. And it's a university, I should say, with a Jewish population of about 30 or 40, very, very small. And I walked in, and I started by talking about openness and thoughtfulness, and asking and giving people time to ask any kind of question. And we had an amazing conversation. And afterwards, people, raised hands and thanked me and said, we just came to learn. And I think people think that all too often people come to fight. And I think most university students today, most people today really want to come to learn and not to fight. And we just need to open that up and unpack that and liberate that part You can't be an educator and not be an optimist. You can't be a Zionist and not be an optimist. You can't do what we do, having these kind of conversations, writing these kind of books, without having faith ultimately in the power of the written word, the power of the idea, and the power of the human being to open our minds and learn and soar. So thank you for learning with me and hopefully soaring with me today.
Very much appreciate your willingness to literally, I sent out the request and you were so kind to be responsive and willing to make the time to do this. I think one of the beauties of the book, The Zionist Ideas, as well as Why I'm a Zionist and a number of your other works, is it makes you think. I think when you have the opportunity to think differently or think in a way that you may haven't before, it creates the idea of wanting to learn more and to want to have conversations. So I want to thank you very much for your works, and obviously want to thank you for making the time to speak so openly with me and for whoever is watching today. I want to wish everyone who's watching today to stay safe, stay healthy, of course. And Gil, I just wanted to thank you again for obviously joining us today.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Have a wonderful day, everyone.